She had everything: the empire, the penthouse, the name that made boardrooms go quiet. And he had exactly one thing that mattered: a 7-year-old daughter and the stubborn belief that honesty was worth more than appearances. They should never have met. But one blind date changed everything. And one man, a man with flour on his jacket and no interest in her money, made the most powerful woman in the city feel, for the first time, completely seen. What happens when a billionaire learns that the greatest thing she was missing couldn't be bought? Stay with me until the very end. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been made under a different name. That was the first thing Logan Hayes noticed when the hostess led him through the main floor of Ardent, past the white tablecloths and the low amber lighting and the couples who all looked like they'd practiced being impressive, toward a table near the window where a woman sat alone, her back slightly turned, watching the street below with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to wait without looking like they were waiting. He noticed the name thing because his sister had given him the reservation slip herself, and the name on it read M. Carroll, not Vanessa Sterling. He didn't think much of it at the time. He was 32 minutes late, and his left shoe had a scuff on the toe he hadn't noticed until he was already inside, and the maitre d' had looked at his jacket. A good jacket, navy, but not a this restaurant jacket, with the specific kind of polite blankness that somehow communicated everything. Logan had almost turned around twice on the drive over. Once at a red light when his daughter Maisie had called him from his sister's apartment to tell him she'd found a spider in the bathroom and was not going to be sleeping ever again. And once in the parking garage when he'd sat in his car for 4 full minutes with both hands on the wheel, asking himself what exactly he thought was going to happen tonight. He was a kitchen designer. He drove a 6-year-old Civic with a car seat in the back. His last serious relationship had ended 19 months ago when his ex-girlfriend told him, with remarkable gentleness, that she'd realized she didn't want to be a stepmother, and she thought he deserved to know that before things went further. He thanked her. They'd stood in the parking lot of a grocery store and hugged, and then she'd driven away, and Logan had gone back inside and stood in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes before he remembered he'd forgotten to buy oatmeal. He was not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of man who belonged in Ardent. But his sister Claudia had looked at him across her kitchen table 2 weeks ago with the expression she'd been perfecting since she was 14. That specific combination of concern and impatience that meant she'd already made a decision and was waiting for him to catch up. And she'd said, "Her name is Vanessa. She's sharp and she's funny, and she doesn't know you're a designer yet, because I told her you worked in architecture, which isn't technically a lie." "That's completely a lie," Logan said. "It's a category," Claudia said. "Listen, just go. Wear the navy jacket. Don't talk about grout." He'd almost talked about grout twice on the drive over. The woman at the table turned when he was about 10 feet away, and Logan's first thought, quick and involuntary, the kind of thought that arrives before you have any say in it, was that Claudia had undersold her. Not in the way people meant when they said that. Not in the way that reduced a person to their face and their clothes. He meant something harder to articulate. The way Vanessa Sterling looked at him when he approached had the quality of someone genuinely paying attention, not performing attention. And there was a difference, and most people didn't know the difference. And apparently he'd been starving for it without knowing it, because something in his chest did a thing it had no business doing before he'd even opened his mouth. "Logan," he said, extending his hand. "I'm late. I'm sorry. There was a spider." She blinked. "A spider?" "My daughter. She's 7. She was visiting my sister, and she found a spider in the bathroom, and the phone call required some negotiation." He sat down. "She wants me to tell you the spider was enormous, for the record. I cannot verify this because I was not there." Vanessa Sterling looked at him for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to make him wonder if he'd already done something wrong. And then she laughed. Not the polished, closed-mouth version he'd half expected from a woman who had her photograph in business magazines, but a real one, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and she said, "What's her name?" "Maisie." "And did Maisie prevail?" "She relocated to the living room with a flashlight and my sister's dog. I think it's a draw." Vanessa smiled. It was a complicated smile, the kind that had more than one thing going on behind it. "I appreciate the full briefing." "I try to be thorough." A waiter arrived, introduced himself as Mathieu with a pronunciation that made Logan feel vaguely like he'd wandered into a foreign country, and presented menus that were the kind of menus that didn't have prices on them, which Logan always found either romantic or alarming, depending on his bank balance that week. This week it was the second one. He looked at the menu anyway. "Can I ask you something?" Vanessa said. He looked up. "Do you actually want to be here?" She said it without an edge, without accusation. She was watching him the way she'd been watching the street, with that steady, unhurried attention. And he had the strange sense that she was asking because she genuinely didn't know, and that she was prepared to accept either answer. "I want to eat," he said honestly. "I'm not sure about here specifically." She tilted her head, almost imperceptibly. "Say more." He set down the menu. "I looked this place up before I came. It's got good food. Probably excellent food. But everything in here is designed to make you feel like what you're doing is significant and exclusive and worth the price tag, which is a strategy, and it's a perfectly valid strategy, but it's also—" He paused. "It makes it hard to talk like a normal person. Everything feels like it's being performed, for the room." He waited for her expression to shift, for the polite recalibration that would signal he'd said the wrong thing, or the wrong version of the right thing, or that she'd expected someone who was more comfortable in rooms like this, and was now doing the math on whether to stay through dinner anyway. Instead, Vanessa Sterling closed her menu. "I hate it here," she said. He looked at her. "You picked it." "My assistant picked it. I told her somewhere nice. I should have been more specific about what I meant by nice." She looked around the room slowly, the way someone does when they're finally letting themselves see something they've been pretending not to notice. "It's very beautiful. It's also completely airless. I feel like I've been here before, in about 30 different versions, and I've never once left thinking about anything except whether the valet was going to scratch my car." Logan watched her. "Where would you actually want to go?" "I don't know. Somewhere where the lights aren't specifically calibrated to make everyone look expensive." She looked back at him. "Is that a terrible thing to say about a restaurant that costs $200 a plate?" "I think it might be the most honest thing anyone's said to me in about 8 months, Logan said. She laughed again. Same unguarded quality. And something about it made him feel, for the first time in longer than he could measure, like the evening might actually go somewhere real. "We could leave," he said. She went still. Not in a threatened way. In the way of someone encountering an option they hadn't genuinely considered as available. "We could," she said carefully. "Just leave?" "I know a place about 6 blocks from here. They sell tacos out of a truck parked outside a laundromat. The tables are plastic, and the lighting is a string of bulbs someone stapled to a fence. And the Al Pastor is the best thing within a 5-mile radius of this building." He paused. "It costs $11. Vanessa Sterling, Billionaire, looked at him across the white tablecloth and the amber light and the careful architecture of a room designed to make people feel important. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." They walked. That was the thing Logan would remember later when he tried to explain to Claudia what the night had been. Not the food, not the conversation, not any single thing either of them said, but the fact that they walked 6 blocks through the city on a Tuesday evening in early October, and she hadn't suggested calling a car, and he hadn't offered, and somewhere between the second and third block they fell into a rhythm that felt completely natural and also like something he'd been waiting a long time to find. Vanessa walked the way she'd sat, with a kind of contained energy, purposeful without being stiff, like someone who spent most of their time moving through spaces they'd already mapped and was mildly curious to see what an unmapped one felt like. She was wearing a dress that was clearly expensive but not ostentatious, dark navy, and she'd taken off whatever heels she'd had on and was carrying them in one hand. He noticed that when she stepped onto the first stretch of uneven sidewalk and switched to bare feet without comment or ceremony, just pulled off the shoes and tucked them under her arm, which was so matter-of-fact about it that he felt an irrational surge of affection for her. "How does a kitchen designer end up on a blind date in a place like Ardent?" she asked. "My sister has ambitions for me," he said. "Also, I think she told you I worked in architecture." "She did," Vanessa said. "I let it go because it sounded like the kind of thing someone says when they're trying to help a sibling seem impressive and the sibling doesn't know it." He looked sideways at her. Was that annoying? It was human, she said. I found it endearing, actually. It told me something about the sibling before I met him. She glanced at him. Your sister loves you. She drives me insane, he said. But yes, those aren't mutually exclusive. No, he said. They're not. They rounded the corner and he could see the taco truck 2 blocks ahead, the string lights already lit even though it was barely 8, orange and yellow against the October dark. There was a small scattering of plastic tables on the sidewalk and 2 older men playing chess at one of them, and a teenager eating alone with earbuds in, and the whole scene had the comfortable, unselfconscious quality of a place that had never been reviewed in a magazine. There, Logan said. Vanessa looked. He watched her look. It's perfect, she said, and she meant it. He could tell the difference. They ordered at the window. He got the El Pastor, she got carnitas with everything, and she insisted on paying before he could argue, and he didn't push it because she'd already handed over the cash by the time he'd reached for his wallet, and he suspected she'd done it deliberately. He filed that away. She was precise and quick when she wanted to be, and she made decisions with the low-level efficiency of someone who'd learned to move through the world without friction. They took the table farthest from the street, and the plastic chairs were slightly uneven, and the paper plates were inadequate for the volume of what they'd ordered. And none of it mattered because Vanessa Sterling took her first bite of carnitas and made a sound that was entirely involuntary and entirely genuine and said, Okay, why is this better than everything I've eaten in the past 3 months? Because nobody spent 30 minutes plating it, Logan said. That's it? That and the chef actually gives a damn, you can tell. The El Pastor has been marinated for at least 12 hours, possibly more. That's not a shortcut kind of flavor. She looked at him. You notice those things. Occupational contamination. I spend a lot of time thinking about what makes a space work or not work, which bleeds into everything else. Food, rooms, conversations. He stopped. That sounds more pretentious than I meant it. No, she said. It doesn't. It sounds like someone who pays attention. She picked up her taco again. I appreciate that. In my world, there aren't many people who do it without agenda. He wasn't sure whether to follow that thread. It felt like it led somewhere important, or somewhere she wasn't ready to go. And he was trying to read the difference. He waited, eating, watching the chess game across the patio without watching it. She followed his gaze. Do you play? My father taught me. I'm not very good. Maisie is beating me consistently, which is humbling. How old is she again? 7. She's been playing for 8 months. She has no patience for ceremony. She just goes directly at whatever she thinks is the actual problem, ignores everything else, and it works about 60% of the time. He smiled at the table. Drives me insane. I keep trying to teach her to think 3 moves ahead and she keeps telling me that's boring. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she has good instincts, she said. She has terrifying instincts, Logan said. I'm slightly concerned about what she's going to be like at 20. Formidable, Vanessa said, and there was something in her voice when she said it, a tone that wasn't quite wistful, but wasn't quite not, that made Logan look up. She was looking at the chess game, or past it, or at something that wasn't there. Do you have... he started. No, she said simply. I've spent the last several years deciding whether I wanted to, and I keep pushing it back to a later version of my life that I'm not sure I'm building correctly. She said it with a particular kind of flatness that wasn't coldness. It was the voice of someone describing a wound they'd looked at so many times they'd learned to describe it without flinching. I run 3 companies, I sit on 2 charitable boards, my father had a cardiac event 8 months ago and is still recovering, and most of my personal relationships exist in the service of something larger than themselves. She looked at him. That's a very unusual sentence to say to someone you've known for 45 minutes. It's not unusual, Logan said. It's just honest. There's a difference. She studied him. Most people would have said something comfortable. I'm not trying to be comfortable, he said. I'm trying to be accurate. The string lights above them swayed slightly in the wind. A car went past on the street. The chess game ended in handshakes, and the 2 older men began resetting the board. Your father, Logan said. Is he doing better? She exhaled slowly. Some days. He had the attack at a board meeting, which is fitting in a dark sort of way, because the meeting was about a financial restructuring of the company he built from nothing, and I'd been telling him for 2 years that he needed to hand over the operational decisions, and he'd been telling me for 2 years that he would think about it. She turned her coffee cup between her palms. He thought about it from a hospital bed, which is not how I wanted to be right about something. No, Logan said. I imagine not. The company is fine. He's fine. Or he will be. He's at his house upstate and he calls me every Thursday to argue about the quarterly report, which the cardiologist assures me is probably not actually helping his recovery, but is also apparently non-negotiable. Something shifted in her expression. A complicated relief or love or both. He's stubborn. It's his best quality and his worst quality, and I learned everything I know about running a business from watching him be both. Logan said nothing. He waited, and she let the pause settle, and it occurred to him that she was someone who'd spent years in rooms where silence needed to be filled and was still learning what to do with one that didn't. What happened with Maisie's mother? She asked. She said it carefully, but she asked it directly, which he respected. She left when Maisie was 11 months old, he said. Not dramatically, no screaming, no affair. She looked at us one morning and realized she didn't want the life we were building, and she told me, and I think it cost her something to tell me honestly instead of just leaving without explanation, and I've tried to be fair about that over the years. He straightened the edge of his paper plate. She's in Vancouver now. She sends birthday cards. Maisie knows she exists. They don't have a relationship. He paused. Maisie has mostly stopped asking about it, which is either healthy or its own kind of answer, and I try not to project my interpretation onto it. Do you think about it? Vanessa asked. Still? About her? No, about what it did to Maisie? Yeah. About whether I'm getting it right, raising her alone? Constantly. He looked up. There's no roadmap. You make it up every day and hope the foundation is solid enough that the mistakes don't load bare. Vanessa was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her yet. Or maybe he had, earlier, when she'd taken her shoes off and stepped onto the sidewalk without ceremony. The expression of someone lowering something they'd been holding at shoulder height for a very long time. She's lucky, Vanessa said. Maisie? To have someone who thinks about it that carefully. She said it simply, without performance. Not everyone does. He held her gaze for a moment, and then looked away, because the moment was delicate and he didn't want to rush it or harden it into something that would break. They were there for 2 hours. The coffee went cold and they got more. The chess players left and came back with a thermos and played another game. The teenager with the earbuds was replaced by a young couple who argued briefly about where they were going next and then laughed about it and left together. Logan and Vanessa talked about the city. She'd grown up in it in a way he hadn't, insulated by private schools and carefully arranged social lives, which had its own loneliness that wasn't the loneliness he knew, but was still loneliness. He'd grown up in the northeast corner of it, in a neighborhood that had been called transitional for 20 years and was now called up and coming, which he thought was a different way of saying the same thing. His mother had worked double shifts at a hospital. His father had driven trucks until his back gave out, and the kitchen in their apartment had been where everything important happened. Arguments, reconciliations, birthdays celebrated over store-brand cake, and maybe that was why he'd ended up designing kitchens, trying to build for other families the version of that space that was sturdy enough to hold whatever weight got put in it. Vanessa listened to all of it in a way that felt structural, like she was actually incorporating it rather than waiting for a pause to speak. She talked about the early years of her first company, a logistics software startup she'd launched at 23 with borrowed money and a level of certainty she described now as either visionary or delusional depending on her mood that day, and about the particular kind of loneliness that came with success, which was different from the loneliness of not having anything, because at least that one had a visible cause. This one hid. It dressed itself as busyness and traveled in expensive cars and showed up at events and shook hands, and every so often, in the back of a car at 1 a.m. after a gala or a dinner or a deal she'd spent 6 months closing, she would feel it sitting there beside her, and she would ride the rest of the way home without acknowledging it, because acknowledging it felt like a kind of failure she wasn't willing to admit to. That's not failure, Logan said. That's just... He searched. That's just being awake. She looked at him. Feeling it means you know what's missing, he said. People who don't feel it, they're the ones in trouble. They've gone somewhere else. Where? Wherever you go when you stop asking the question, he said. I don't know. I've never been there. I've been in the parking lot, maybe, but I always came back. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. How do you do that? She said. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a genuine question, slightly rough at the edges, the kind that comes from a place where asking feels risky. Stay present, even when it's hard, even when you're doing all of it by yourself. He thought about it honestly, which meant he didn't answer immediately. He looked at the string lights and thought about Maisie asleep at his sister's place and the spider in the bathroom and the scuff on his shoe and the maitre d' with his practiced blankness. Maisie, he said finally. Mostly Maisie. She doesn't let you disappear. She's too immediate. She needs a sandwich, and she can't find her left shoe, and she wants to know why the moon looks bigger in winter, and she needs you to answer all of it right now, and you do it. And somewhere in the middle of all the right nowness, the big abstract dread loses its grip. He paused. I don't know if that's wisdom or if I'm just busy enough that despair can't find parking. Vanessa made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. I think, she said carefully, that might be the most useful thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. He looked at her across the plastic table and the cold coffee and the swaying lights. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. The reservation, the name on the slip was Nem Carroll. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprised, she'd been waiting for it maybe, or something like it. Yes. Is that something you do regularly? She exhaled slowly through her nose. More often than I'd like to admit. When you're a known name, making a reservation under your own name means the table is ready 15 minutes early. The sommelier appears unprompted. The chef sends something out. The couple 2 tables over keeps looking. She stopped. I've had dates who spent the entire evening performing for the room because of who I was. Not a meal, not a conversation, a performance. She looked down at her cup. The Carol name is for when I want to find out if the room changes when nobody knows who's in it. And tonight? Tonight I was going to be Carol for the whole dinner and then never see you again, and write the evening off as another well-intentioned catastrophe. She looked at him directly. And then you said you weren't sure about the restaurant, and something in me just... It was like a switch. Like, oh, this is a different conversation. He held her gaze. I'm glad it was. So am I, she said. More than I expected. The taco truck closed down at 10:30, the window shuddering with a metallic rattle, and the owner, a broad-shouldered man named Jorge, who'd nodded at Logan when they ordered, clearly recognizing a regular, waving a hand as he killed the exterior lights. The string lights stayed on. They stayed at the table. Around 11, a text from Claudia arrived. Maisie's asleep. Spider has been relocated to the garden with full honors. You owe me. How is it going? He tilted the screen so Vanessa could read it, without thinking about it, which was maybe the most natural thing he'd done all evening, and she read it and bit her lip against a smile and said, Your sister is very invested. Catastrophically invested, he said. She's been trying to set me up for 2 years. I've said no to every single one. Why did you say yes to this one? He looked at her. She called in a specific debt. I borrowed her car in April and I'm still paying for it. What happened to the car? Nothing happened to the car, he said. Nothing significant. The car is completely fine. I am not going to specify any further. She laughed, and he laughed, and it was the best kind of laughter. The kind that came from somewhere real and left the air lighter than it had found it. Around 11:30, she looked at her phone and said she should go, and he said he should too, and they both stood but neither of them moved immediately, standing on opposite sides of the plastic table in the quiet. After the laughter, the string lights doing their small orange work above them. Thank you for suggesting we leave, she said. Thank you for agreeing, he said. You said it was the best tacos within 5 miles. That was your pitch. My pitch was accurate. It was, she said. Terrifyingly accurate. They stood there for another moment. I'd like to do this again, he said. Differently from how I usually say things like that. I actually want to see you again. Not because it's the polite thing to say at the end of an evening that went well, but because I've spent 4 hours with you, and I'm not finished with the conversation. She looked at him for a moment, that steady, unhurried look she'd had since the beginning, the one that felt like it was taking something in rather than reflecting something back. "I'd like that," she said. "I don't say that lightly. I want you to know that. I say a lot of things lightly. This isn't one of them." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The car she'd called, not the company car, he noticed, just a regular rideshare, pulled up to the curb, and she picked up her shoes, which she'd been carrying since the third block, and he walked with her to the door, and she got in, and she looked up at him through the open window with an expression that was direct and undefended, and said, "Tell Maisie the spider will survive outside." "I'll tell her," he said. "She'll want verification." "I know people," Vanessa said, completely seriously. "I'll see what I can do." He was still laughing when the car pulled away. He stood on the sidewalk outside the closed taco truck with the string light still swaying overhead and his phone in his pocket and the scuff on his shoe and the cold October air, and something in his chest that had been quiet for a very long time was not quiet anymore. He didn't have a name for it yet. He didn't push it. He just stood there for another minute, letting it be what it was, before he turned and walked back toward the parking garage and the Civic and the drive back to Claudia's apartment where Maisie was asleep in the spare room with a flashlight and a borrowed dog. The city moved around him, indifferent and enormous and full of lights. He walked through it feeling, for the first time in longer than he could measure, like something good was beginning. End of part 1. He didn't text her that night. He'd thought about it on the drive back to Claudia's, the city lights blurring past the windows, the radio on low, Maisie's car seat visible in the rear view mirror even though it was empty. He had her number. She'd put it in his phone herself, standing at the curb, typing with the unhurried precision of someone who didn't second-guess small decisions. And he'd looked at it twice at red lights, not composing anything, just looking at it the way you look at something you want to be careful with. He didn't text. It was 11:47 and it felt too soon. Not because of any rule about timing, but because what had happened that evening felt like something that needed to settle before he touched it again. Like fresh concrete, like a thing still finding its shape. He picked up Maisie the next morning. She was awake before him, naturally, sitting at Claudia's kitchen table eating cereal and conducting a detailed debrief of the spider situation with Claudia's dog, who was receiving this information with the focused patience of a very good listener. "Dad," Maisie said, without looking up from the dog, "Claudia says you were on a date." "Claudia talks too much," Logan said. "Was she pretty?" "That's not really the point of a date." Maisie considered this. "Was she nice?" "Yeah," he said. "She was nice." Maisie looked up at him then, with the unsettling directness she'd inherited from somewhere he couldn't identify, since he'd never figured out where she'd gotten it. 7 years old, and she looked at him like she was running some kind of internal calculation. "Are you going to see her again?" "Maybe," he said. "Okay," Maisie said, and went back to the dog, apparently satisfied, which was either a good sign or the kind of patience that meant she was saving her questions for later, which in his experience was worse. He texted Vanessa at 10:15 that morning. Just, "The spider has been confirmed alive and relocated. Maisie requires verification at some point. No pressure on timeline." She replied 11 minutes later. "Noted. I'll arrange paperwork. Are you free Thursday evening?" He was free Thursday evening. They met at a small Vietnamese place in the east side of the city that Vanessa had actually picked herself this time, not her assistant, which she mentioned in passing and which Logan understood was a distinction that mattered to her. The restaurant was bright and loud and slightly chaotic in the way of a place doing good business without caring much about atmosphere, which he appreciated. They ordered too much food. Neither of them finished it. They talked for 3 hours. That was how the first week went. Thursday dinner. A walk after that lasted longer than the dinner. A phone call on Sunday that started as a logistics conversation about whether they were doing something again that week and became a 2-hour conversation about something else entirely. He couldn't even remember afterward what they'd talked about, only that he'd been sitting on his back steps watching Maisie through the kitchen window while she did homework, and the light had changed around him, and he'd looked up at one point and realized it was almost 9. By the second week, the thing between them had a momentum he hadn't entirely planned for. He wasn't naive about it. He knew who she was. He'd known from the beginning, but there was a difference between knowing abstractly that the woman sitting across from you was worth $800 million and having it become concrete, which it did, gradually, in small ways. The car that picked her up some evenings when it was late. The way conversations sometimes paused when her phone lit up with something that required immediate attention, and she handled it in 60 seconds with a precision that gave him a glimpse of the other version of her, the one that existed in boardrooms and press conferences, and the kind of decisions that affected hundreds of people at once. The name recognition. Once at the Vietnamese place, a woman at a nearby table had recognized her and spent 15 minutes debating with herself visibly before coming over, apologizing profusely, asking for a photo, and Vanessa had been gracious and warm about it in a way that looked completely natural, which he suspected meant she'd been doing it for years. He'd watched that exchange and thought about the M. Carroll reservation, and understood it a little better. "Does that happen a lot?" he asked after the woman left. "Often enough that I've stopped noticing it consciously," Vanessa said, "which probably means I notice it more than I think." She looked down at her plate. "Does it bother you?" He thought about the honest answer. "Not right now," he said. "Ask me in a month." She'd looked at him steadily when he said that, and something in her expression had shifted. A kind of relief, maybe, or the recognition of a person who was going to keep telling her the truth even when the easier thing was available. She hadn't said anything. She'd just picked up her chopsticks again and reached across the table for the last of the spring rolls, which was also a kind of answer. It was in the third week that she told him about Damien. She didn't lead with the name. She led with something that happened that afternoon. A message on her personal number, a number very few people had, which meant whoever sent it had either been given it or had found it deliberately, and either option had its own implications. She told him about it over the phone, and her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Not fear exactly, but the particular flatness of someone containing fear through an act of will. "What kind of message?" he said. A pause. "The kind that's designed to remind you of something without saying it outright. Plausible deniability built in. Nothing you could take to anyone official and point to." Another pause. It said, "I saw you walking east side Thursday. Looked like a good dinner. Hope the new company is worth it." Logan was quiet. "Someone's watching you," he said. "Someone has been watching me for considerably longer than Thursday," she said, and the flatness in her voice had gotten heavier, and underneath it there was something tired, a weight that sounded like it had been carried for a long time. "His name is Damien Cross. We knew each other years ago. Before the third company, before most of it. Knew each other. We were together, briefly, or it felt brief in retrospect. At the time, it lasted about 14 months, and it constituted the worst period of my professional life, which is saying something because I've had some genuinely bad ones." She exhaled. "When I started the logistics company, I was 23 and I was undercapitalized, and I'd been turned down by 11 investors in 6 months, and I was starting to believe them when they told me I was too young and too inexperienced and that the market wasn't ready. Damien was 31. He was in finance. He came to a pitch meeting I wasn't expecting him at, and he said yes when nobody else was. He gave me a bridge loan that kept the company alive for 8 months while I found actual backers. And now he uses that to... He never lets it go." Her voice was quiet and very even. "Not in any way you could document. No threats, nothing explicit. Just the continuous, low-level presence of someone who believes that because he helped you once, he has permanent claim. He turns up at events I attend. He knows my schedule through connections I haven't been able to fully trace. He sends messages like today's that are technically just observations, innocent observations, the kind that are designed to tell you, 'I'm still here, I'm still watching, don't forget what you owe me.'" Logan sat with this for a moment. He was in his work van in a parking lot. He'd taken the call on the way back from a client meeting, and the city was doing its ordinary afternoon business around him while he tried to think about what he was hearing carefully enough to be useful. "Have you talked to anyone? Legally?" "I've talked to 3 lawyers," she said. "The general consensus is that what he's doing is deeply unpleasant and legally borderline at most. Nothing explicit. Nothing that crosses the line cleanly enough to give me traction." A pause. I've also been advised more than once that making this public would be complicated. He's connected. He sits on the board of two foundations I have relationships with. He knows people who know people whose opinions affect my business interests, which he is fully aware of. He picked his position carefully, Logan said. He's intelligent, Vanessa said. I want to be clear about that. What he does isn't stupid or impulsive. It's deliberate, and it's been calibrated over a long time. The loan he gave me, the timing of it, I've wondered since whether it was always a strategy, whether he saw something worth controlling and moved on it before I had the experience to recognize what was happening. And you've been living with this. I've been managing it, she said, and the distinction in her voice was clear and had a kind of exhausted pride in it. There's a difference. Is there? He said, not unkindly. A long pause. I don't know, she said. Maybe not. He looked out the windshield at nothing in particular. A pigeon walked across the hood of the car next to him with the purposeful indifference of something that owned the world. Thank you for telling me, he said. I almost didn't, she said. I've almost not told people before. It's easier in some ways. If I don't tell them, I can pretend it's just a background irritation, something I'm handling, not something that shapes how I move through my own life. Her voice was very quiet now. But I'm tired of pretending that. You don't have to pretend anything with me, he said. I want to be useful, not comfortable. Tell me what that means for what this is. What does it mean for you that he saw us Thursday? It means he knows you exist, she said. And Damien tends to treat the things that matter to me as leverage. Logan held the phone and thought about that. Thought about Maisie. Thought about the string lights and the plastic chairs and the feeling 2 weeks ago that something good was beginning. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay, he said again. I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that. But I want us to talk about this more. In person, not over the phone. Can we do that? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, and the word was smaller than her other words. Yes, we can do that. They met that Friday. Not a restaurant, not this time. She came to his neighborhood, which he'd offered without overthinking it, and he'd ordered from the Thai place 2 blocks away and set up his kitchen table with the functional unself-consciousness of a man who cooked in his own kitchen regularly and didn't possess the instinct to perform hospitality. 2 mismatched chairs. A table that had a scratch from when Maisie had decided, at age 4, that forks were also art tools. Food in the containers it came in. Vanessa had arrived in a car he didn't recognize, and a jacket he hadn't seen before, and an expression that was doing a lot of work keeping itself neutral. And when she walked into his kitchen, she'd looked around it with the same quality of attention she'd given the taco truck and the string lights, not assessing, just taking it in. And then she'd sat down and said, "This is a good kitchen." "I designed it myself," he said. "The previous layout was criminal." "What did you change?" "Moved the sink to the island, repositioned the refrigerator so the door doesn't swing into the prep space, took out an upper cabinet row to let light into the corner." He set down the food. "Now I sound like I'm narrating a renovation show." "You sound like someone who thinks carefully about how spaces feel to use," she said, "which you've mentioned before. I'm noticing it's consistent." He sat across from her. "I'm a pretty consistent person." "I'm starting to understand that," she said, and there was something in how she said it, a quality like someone testing weight on a surface they'd been told might hold. They ate, and he let her be quiet, and she was quiet for the first 10 minutes in a way that didn't feel like withdrawal, just processing, just someone sitting in a room that felt different from the room she usually sat in and letting herself feel the difference. Then she talked about Damien, really talked about it this time. Not the careful, managed version he'd gotten on the phone, with the legal parameters already sketched out and the emotional content kept at arm's length. This was the version underneath that. She'd been 23 and she'd been terrified, though she hadn't let herself use that word at the time. She'd launched the company on borrowed money, and a conviction she'd since realized was partly intelligence and partly the specific arrogance of someone who doesn't know enough yet to understand the full scope of what they're risking. She'd worked 18-hour days and slept in the office twice a week and eaten whatever was available and called her father every Sunday to tell him it was going well, which it wasn't, not for the first 4 months, which were the hardest 4 months of her life. Damien had come to a pitch meeting uninvited, through a mutual contact she'd trusted more than she should have, and he'd been impressive. Not flashy. He wasn't built for flash. He was the kind of impressive that came from asking the right questions, from understanding a business model well enough to identify its actual weak points, rather than the easy target ones. He'd said yes to the bridge loan inside a week. He'd asked for nothing except a small equity stake and a monthly lunch. The lunches had become other things. She told this part without dramatics, with a flatness that Logan understood now was not indifference but control. The control of someone who'd learned that showing the full weight of it caused certain kinds of problems. She'd been grateful, and grateful had made her less guarded than she should have been. And by the time she understood the shape of what was happening, that the help had come with an accounting she'd never agreed to, that Damien's generosity operated as a ledger, and she was always on the deficit side of it. She was 8 months deep, and the company was no longer in danger, and the bridge loan had been repaid in full, and she'd ended it. She'd ended it cleanly. He hadn't made a scene. He'd received the conversation with something that looked like grace, which she now understood was tactical, and then 6 months later he'd turned up at a charity event she attended and said hello to her like an old friend, and she'd realized it wasn't over. It had just moved into a different form. "He never asked me for anything specific," she said. "That's the part that makes it so hard to fight. He's never demanded money or asked me to do something concrete that I could refuse. He's just present. He shows up. He observes. He sends messages that say technically nothing. He cultivates relationships with people adjacent to me so that removing him from my life would require removing 15 other things." She looked down at the takeout container. "He's made himself structural. That's the right word. He figured out how to become part of the architecture of my life without me ever choosing it." Logan was quiet for a moment. "You said earlier that you've wondered if the loan was always a strategy," he said. "Do you actually believe that? Or is that the version that emerged later, after you had more information?" She looked up at him. "Both," she said. "I think he saw an opportunity and he moved on it, and I think the relationship was genuine in the way that things can be genuine while also being strategic. I don't think he's purely calculating. I think he actually—" She stopped. "I think he actually wanted what he thought I was. And when I turned out to have limits and boundaries and a sense of myself that didn't accommodate what he needed, he restructured into a version that he could sustain without my cooperation." "He couldn't let go," Logan said. "He couldn't conceive of a version of the situation in which he didn't have claim," she said. "That's different from not letting go. Letting go requires you to have understood it as yours to hold." Damien never thought in those terms. In his mind, the transaction was still open. Logan got up and refilled their water glasses without being asked, which was partly because he needed a moment and partly because it was the kind of small, ordinary thing that kept a conversation from becoming too airless. "Does he know about Maisie?" he said when he sat back down. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know what he knows about you yet. What does that mean for you, for how you're thinking about this?" She held his gaze. "It means I'm sitting here having a conversation I haven't had with anyone in 4 years, and I'm aware that doing so means involving someone else in a situation that has a history of becoming complicated for the people near me." Her voice had a roughness in it, not emotion exactly, more the sound of words being chosen very carefully from among several available options. "I don't want to do that to you. I want you to understand what it actually looks like before you decide." "Vanessa," he said. She stopped. "I'm a 32-year-old single father," he said. "I've been managing complicated for 7 years. Don't make the decision for me about what I can handle." She looked at him, and the roughness in her expression didn't go away, but something behind it shifted. "I'm not trying to manage you," she said. "I know," he said. "But you're doing it anyway. Old habit, probably." A pause. "Probably," she said. "Tell me what would actually help," he said. "Not what you think you should handle alone. What would actually help?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he was patient with it, not moving to fill it, just waiting. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've been managing it alone for long enough that I'm not sure I know what help looks like." "That's honest," he said. "I'm trying," she said. "I know," he said. "I can tell." They sat in his kitchen with the food going cold and the scratch on the table and the October wind doing something against the window, And Vanessa Sterling looked at him with an expression that was complicated and genuine and a little bit frightened, not of him, he understood, but of whatever it meant that she was sitting here at all, in this kitchen that was designed to feel useful rather than impressive, telling things to a person she'd known for 3 weeks that she hadn't told anyone in 4 years. He didn't tell her it was going to be fine. He didn't make promises he had no capacity to keep. He just sat across from her and met her gaze and let it be what it was. 2 people in a kitchen figuring something out, with nothing guaranteed and the understanding between them already deeper than either of them had expected to allow. Somewhere in the city, Damian Cross knew where they'd had dinner on Thursday. Neither of them said that out loud. But it was in the room. It had been in the room all evening, and they both knew it, and they'd talked around it and through it and decided, by sitting here at all, that they weren't going to let it determine the terms of what they were building. That was not a small decision. Neither of them knew yet how much it was going to cost. After Vanessa left that night, late, past midnight, after they'd moved from the kitchen to the couch and the conversation had slowed into something quieter and easier, the kind of talk that doesn't produce anything except the sensation of being in the right place, Logan stood at his kitchen window and looked at the street below for a while. Maisie was at his mother's for the night. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when she wasn't in it. An absence with a shape, a room that knew it was waiting. He stood there and thought about Damian Cross and what it meant to be structural in someone's life without their consent. He thought about Vanessa's voice when she'd said he made himself part of the architecture and the way that phrasing had landed, coming from her, because she was someone who understood architecture. Not buildings, but systems, structures, the way things were arranged to produce particular outcomes. And if she was using that language, she meant it precisely. He thought about what it would take to dismantle something structural. You couldn't just wish it away. You couldn't ignore it out of existence. You had to understand where it was load-bearing and where it wasn't, and you had to work carefully and in the right order, and even then there was a period of instability before the new thing could hold. He'd done it in kitchens. He knew the feeling. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and he lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, not anxious, just awake and aware, holding the facts of his life and the facts of hers and the territory that was beginning to form between them, still unmapped, still uncertain, but real in the way that only things formed from genuine materials could be real. Whatever was coming, he was not going to be the kind of person who left when it arrived. He was fairly sure about that, and he held it like a quiet thing as the city went on outside his window. And eventually the wakefulness loosened its grip, and he slept. The 4th week was the one where things started to feel possible. Not certain. Logan had enough experience with his own life to know the difference between possible and certain, and he wasn't the kind of person who confused them, but possible in the way that a structure feels possible when the foundation turns out to be more solid than you'd initially estimated, like something that could hold real weight if you were careful about how you loaded it. He and Vanessa had developed a rhythm that surprised him with how naturally it had arrived. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, usually evenings, always somewhere they'd chosen themselves rather than somewhere that chose them. A bookstore on the west side that had a small cafe in the back. A park near the river when the October weather cooperated. His kitchen, twice more, because something about the kitchen seemed to work for both of them. The ordinariness of it, the functional unpretentiousness, the fact that there was always something to do with your hands when the conversation got heavy. She'd met Maisie on a Wednesday. It had not been planned, which Logan suspected was why it worked. He'd been on the phone with Vanessa when he'd picked Maisie up from school, and Maisie had climbed into the back seat and immediately asked who he was talking to, and instead of ending the call, he'd said without thinking about it, "Someone I want you to talk to. Her name is Vanessa." And before he'd fully processed what he was doing, he'd put the phone on speaker. There had been a brief silence, and then Maisie had said, with the direct practicality of a 7-year-old who had already done her own assessment, "Are you the one who knows about the spider?" And Vanessa, without missing a beat, had said, "I filed the paperwork personally." Maisie had considered this. "What paperwork?" "Official relocation documentation," Vanessa said. "Species, date, destination. The spider is in the municipal record." Another pause. "Does he have a name?" "The spider? I left that to the discretion of the garden team." Maisie had laughed, sudden and delighted, The laugh she made when something was actually funny to her and not just performed to make an adult feel good about their joke. Logan had watched the rearview mirror while he drove, the city sliding past, and the tightness he'd been carrying in his chest about whether this particular introduction would land correctly had loosened completely. They'd met in person 5 days later. Vanessa had come by on a Saturday afternoon with no agenda, just shown up, which Logan had suggested and which he knew was a test of sorts, not a test of Vanessa, but of the thing itself, whether it could survive contact with the texture of his actual life, rather than just the edited version he presented in restaurants and conversations. Maisie had been in the middle of a complicated project involving cardboard, approximately 47 markers, and a vision for a city for insects that she'd been developing for 2 weeks. Vanessa had sat on the living room floor in jeans and a sweater and asked questions about the city's infrastructure with a seriousness that Maisie immediately recognized as genuine and not performed, and within 20 minutes, Maisie had given her a marker and told her she was in charge of the river district. Logan had made coffee and leaned against the kitchen doorway watching them, and he'd felt something so large and so quiet that he hadn't tried to name it. He'd just let it be there. That was the 4th week. The 5th week was when Damien moved. It started on a Tuesday morning. Logan was at a client site, a renovation in the newer part of the East Side, a couple who couldn't agree on anything and had hired him partly, he suspected, to serve as a professional arbitrator, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He didn't look at it until lunch, and when he did, he sat in his van in the client's driveway and read it twice. Thought you should know who you're actually involved with. Ask Claudia how she knows Vanessa Sterling. There's a version of this story you haven't heard yet. He read it a 3rd time. Then he put the phone face down on the passenger seat and ate his sandwich and looked at the house in front of him and thought, carefully and without panic, about what this message was designed to produce, which was doubt. Which was the specific doubt that arrives when someone you've been trusting is suddenly framed by an outside party as having a hidden motive, and you're required to decide in real time how much faith you have in your own read of the situation. He thought about Claudia. He thought about the night she'd pushed him to take the blind date, the specificity of her investment, the debt she'd called in. He thought about whether any of it felt wrong in retrospect. It didn't. But he also knew that the most effective doubt was the kind planted in soil that had already been turned, the kind that found purchase not in obviously false ground, but in genuine uncertainty. In the small spaces where you genuinely didn't know, and someone with a motive could put something there and watch it grow. He called Vanessa. She answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she wasn't in a meeting or she'd stepped out of one. Someone texted me from an unknown number, he said. They told me to ask Claudia how she knows you. They said there's a version of this story I haven't heard. A beat of silence. When? She said. This morning. I just read it. Another silence, shorter. That's Damien. I figured, he said. What does it mean? She exhaled slowly, and he could hear in that exhale something that wasn't surprise but was still a kind of impact. The sound of someone absorbing a blow they'd been expecting and finding that preparation doesn't entirely cushion it. Your sister and I have met before, she said. Once at a fundraiser for a children's literacy program about 8 months ago. We spoke for maybe 15 minutes. I liked her. She was funny and direct, and she told me she had a brother who was single and smart, and she thought I'd like him. A pause. I forgot about it, or I filed it away. I wasn't in a place to be thinking about that kind of thing at the time, and then several months later I got a call from her. She'd tracked down my assistant's contact through the event organization, and she asked if I was still interested, and I said yes. Logan sat with this. So Claudia made the first move, he said. Claudia made the first move, Vanessa said, and I knew that going into the date. I knew she was your sister. And you didn't tell me. I didn't tell you, she said, because at the time it felt like a detail that didn't matter. It was still a blind date. It was still 2 people meeting. And then it became something real, and the longer it went without me mentioning it, the more it started to feel like an omission, and she stopped. Logan, I should have told you. I know that. He was looking at the house in front of him. The couple inside was probably still arguing about cabinet hardware. Did Claudia tell you anything about me? before we met? She told me you were raising Maisie alone and that you were good at it and that you hadn't let anyone in since your ex-girlfriend left and that she was worried about you in the way you're only worried about someone you love. Vanessa's voice was quiet. She didn't sell you to me. She didn't frame it as a transaction. She said you deserved someone who would show up, and she thought maybe I did too. Logan was quiet. That's Claudia, he said after a moment. I know. She doesn't do subtle. She does direct and slightly overbearing and then acts surprised when you notice. I noticed immediately, Vanessa said. I liked her. He put his elbow on the window frame and looked at the sky, which was doing its November thing, low and gray and non-committal. Why is this what Damien went to? He said. Of all the things he could have done. Because it's the version that targets your trust in me specifically, she said, and her voice had taken on the careful flatness she used when she was thinking through something she'd already partially thought through. He's not stupid. A direct attack on me you'd probably dismiss or come to me about. But if he can make you wonder whether the people closest to you are operating with hidden agendas, whether Claudia set this up for reasons you don't know, then the doubt doesn't just land on me. It lands on everything. Divide the foundation, Logan said. That's exactly what it is. He thought about it. Is there anything else I don't know? She didn't answer immediately, which he noted. Vanessa. There are things about my business that are complicated, she said. Damien has involvement in 2 foundations that connect to my charitable work, which I've been trying to restructure for months. There's a board meeting coming up in 3 weeks that he's positioned himself to attend, and I haven't found a clean way to exclude him without triggering a governance review that would slow down a community project I've been building for the past year. A pause. So there are moving pieces, things I've been managing, but nothing that changes what this is between us. Nothing that makes any of what I've told you untrue. Okay, he said. Okay? I believe you, he said. I want to be clear about that first, before anything else. I believe you. The Claudia thing stings a little, not because it's wrong, but because I feel stupid for not knowing. But it doesn't change what I know about you from the last 5 weeks. Evidence trumps insinuation. He heard her exhale. But I need us to stop operating like these are separate tracks, he said. Whatever's happening with Damien, whatever's happening with the board and the foundations, I need to know. Not because I'm going to fix it, but because I can't support you in something I'm only seeing part of. I know, she said. You're right. I'm not saying this to be right about it, he said. I'm saying it because when I decide to be in something, I'm in it, and I need the same from you. A pause. That's a significant sentence. It's an accurate one, he said. The silence that followed had weight to it, but it wasn't the weight of something wrong. It was the weight of something real, which was different. Can we talk tonight? She said. Yes, he said. Come to mine. I'll cook. You don't have to. I cook when I'm thinking through something, he said. It helps. You can sit in the kitchen and talk while I do it. A brief pause. That's the least romantic way anyone has ever invited me to dinner. I know, he said. See you at 7. He ended the call and sat in the van for another minute, not moving. Outside, a bird landed on the client's mailbox, regarded him briefly, and flew away. He picked up his phone and texted his sister. We need to talk. Not now. Tonight or tomorrow. Don't panic. Claudia's reply came within 30 seconds. I already know. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I'll explain everything. He stared at the message for a moment. Then he texted back. I'm not angry. I just want to understand. We'll talk soon. He put the phone away and went back inside to arbitrate cabinet hardware. Vanessa arrived at 7:12, which he'd learned was as close to on time as she was capable of, because punctuality for her required fighting the entropy of 3 companies and 2 charitable boards, and a father who called on Thursday, and an assistant who was very good at her job but could not stop a meeting from running long by sheer organizational force alone. He'd made pasta, real pasta, from scratch, which Maisie called show-off pasta, and which he only made when something required the full 90 minutes of methodical, slightly meditative effort that the process demanded. Maisie was at her grandmother's for the night. Vanessa came in and sat at the kitchen counter and watched him work, and for a while neither of them said anything. This was something they'd developed, the capacity to share a space without filling it, and he considered it one of the most underrated things about what they'd built. "Tell me everything about Damien and the board," he said, without turning from the stove. She told him. The Community Project, a family resource center in the south side of the city, offering everything from job placement assistance to after-school programs for kids in lower-income neighborhoods, had been Vanessa's priority for the past 18 months. It was connected to her Sterling Family Foundation, which was named for her father, who'd grown up with nothing in this same city and had strong feelings about what that kind of poverty did to children who couldn't see a way out. Damien Cross sat on the board of a corporate philanthropy group, the Aldridge Civic Trust, that had pledged significant co-funding to the project. Without that co-funding, the project's timeline collapsed by at least a year, and possibly longer. He'd positioned himself there with the specific, careful timing of someone who'd known exactly what he was doing, who'd understood that the thing most likely to bring Vanessa to the table wasn't a threat to her business interests, but a threat to something she actually cared about. "He used the project," Logan said. "He used the project," Vanessa said. "He's never said it outright. He doesn't have to. The presence is enough. The message is, if you try to remove me, the funding relationship becomes complicated. And the families waiting for that resource center are the ones who pay for complicated." Logan turned off the burner and turned around. "That's not a coincidence. The timing, the positioning. He researched what mattered to you and built himself into it." "I've had 14 months to reach the same conclusion," she said. "Yes." "What's the board meeting in 3 weeks?" "A formal review of the co-funding structure. There's an agenda item about governance, about whether the Aldridge Trust's involvement should be expanded or restructured. Damien will be there representing the trust. If I raise the issue of his conduct, if I bring any of it into that room, it opens a process that takes months, during which funding is in question, and he knows that." "What if you went in with documentation?" Logan said. She looked at him. "You said you've been building evidence for months," he said. "The messages, the pattern of appearances, the chronology of how he positioned himself. What if you didn't wait for it to be a legal case? What if you brought it to the room directly? In front of the board, in front of the trust representatives, in front of everyone he needs to impress to maintain his position?" "That's not a clean option," she said carefully. "No," he said, "it's a real option. There's a difference." He came around the counter and leaned against it. "You've been playing defense for 4 years. You've been managing this in a way that keeps the blast radius small, which is intelligent, and which has also let him stay exactly where he is. And now he's texting the man I'm dating." He stopped. "The man you're seeing, from unknown numbers, trying to blow up something good because he's decided it's a threat to his access." She was watching him with the still, focused attention she brought to things that mattered. "What changes if you go on offense?" he said. "Not rashly, not without preparation. But what actually changes?" She was quiet for a long moment. "He loses the leverage of my silence," she said. "Right. And I lose the protection of it," she said. "If I bring it into a room that public, it becomes a story. It becomes something people know. Some of those people will be supportive. Some of them will manage the information in ways I can't control." "You're already not in control," Logan said, not unkindly. "He's already texting people in your life. You're already planning your movements around what he might observe. The controlled version isn't working." She looked at him for a long time. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It's not simple," he said. "I know it's not simple. But I think you've been so close to it for so long that you're seeing the complexity more clearly than you're seeing the path." She said nothing. "What would it feel like," he said, "to just tell the truth in a room full of people who need to hear it?" The question sat in the kitchen between them. He watched something move across her face, something that wasn't an answer yet, but was in the direction of one, a calculation being run on different variables than the one she'd been using. "Terrifying," she said. "Yeah," he said. "And possibly necessary," she said. "Yeah," he said again. He pushed off the counter and went back to the pasta because it needed finishing and because he'd made his point, and the rest of it was hers to process in her own time, at her own pace, and pressing would only harden it. They ate at the scratched kitchen table, And the pasta was good, genuinely good, the kind of thing that doesn't happen accidentally, that requires the patience he'd been putting into it for 90 minutes before she'd arrived. And Vanessa ate with the unself-conscious appetite she'd shown at the taco truck, which was one of the things about her that consistently worked against the image she projected in other contexts. They were halfway through dinner when her phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression changed. Not dramatically. She didn't have the kind of face that changed dramatically. But the shift was visible to him because he'd been learning it for 5 weeks, and what he saw in it now was something controlled and cold in a way that was different from composure. She turned the phone face down on the table. "Damien again?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Different approach." "What is it?" She picked the phone back up and turned it toward him. It was a photograph. Logan and Vanessa, outside his building, 2 weeks ago. He recognized the angle. It would have been taken from a car or from the building across the street, elevated enough to capture both of them clearly. They were standing close together, mid-conversation, and the image had been taken with a long lens, the kind of photo that required equipment and preparation and the patience to wait. Below the photo, a single line. "Does she know what she's walking into? Probably not your department to say." Logan looked at the photo for a moment, then he set the phone down. "He's been outside my building," he said. "Yes." The word was flat and careful. Underneath it, something was working, something contained and cold, not panic. She was not a person prone to panic, but a fury that had been held at low heat for a long time and was now finding a higher temperature. "Logan," she said. "I'm not scared," he said immediately, because he understood that was what she was looking at. "I am," she said. "Not for me. I've been managing my fear about this for long enough that it's become furniture. But you didn't sign up for a man with a long lens outside your building." "No," he said. "I didn't." He met her eyes. "But I'm also not leaving because of it. I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not telling you that as a performance. I'm telling you because it's true, and because you need to be able to make decisions about what comes next without calculating my response as a variable." She looked at him with an expression that was very complicated and very real, and had something in it, gratitude and fear, and the specific quality of someone who'd been waiting for the floor to fall out for so long that they'd stopped expecting it not to. "The board meeting," she said. 3 weeks. "Yeah," he said. "I need to think," she said, "about how to do it correctly. Not just emotionally, strategically." "Of course," he said. "That's your territory. I need documentation organized. I need to understand which board members are likely to be sympathetic. I need to think about what the Aldridge Trust's exposure is if his conduct becomes public, whether they'd cut him loose or defend him." "Those all sound like things you already know how to do," he said. "They are," she said. She was looking at nothing in particular, which meant she was looking at something specific inside. "I've been afraid of this room for 4 years. I've been afraid of what it would cost." "What do you think it will actually cost?" he said. A long pause. "Less than 4 more years of this," she said. He nodded once. They finished dinner. She helped him clear the table. She'd started doing this without asking, which was a small thing and not a small thing. And they stood at his kitchen sink in the particular quiet of people who've said everything important and have now arrived at the simpler, steadier thing on the other side of it. "I need to tell you something else," she said. He turned off the tap. 2 nights ago," she said, "I got a message from a different number. Attachments." She was looking at the window above the sink. Old messages between me and Damien from when we were together. Things I wrote, private things. Her jaw was tight. "He's been keeping them. He's now made it clear he has them and is willing to use them." Logan was quiet. "Private in what way?" he said, carefully. Not what you're imagining. Nothing that would be legally actionable in that direction." She was precise about this, controlled, and he understood she was controlling it because the alternative was a kind of exposure she didn't let herself have in front of people. Personal. Vulnerable. Things you write when you trust someone. Things that were true when I wrote them, and that could be read out of context to suggest. Things about my judgment, about decisions I made, About moments when I was less certain than the public version of me is supposed to be. She paused. They're not scandalous, they're just private. And the damage wouldn't come from the content. It would come from the violation. Logan didn't move. He stood at the sink in his kitchen and he looked at her profile, her jaw, the tight line of her shoulders, the careful management of the thing that was clearly trying to get out. And he felt something that he didn't try to suppress or modulate. He was angry. A clean, certain anger, not hot, not explosive, but deep and load-bearing. He's been waiting, Logan said. He kept those messages specifically to use them at the right time. Yes, she said. And now that there's something in your life worth threatening, yes, she said. She turned to look at him, and her expression had the quality of someone who had been standing alone in a room for a very long time and was still not entirely sure whether it was safe to stop. I'm not going to tell you not to be angry, he said. I'm also not going to ask you what you want to do, because I think you already know. I think you've known for a while. I've known for longer than I've been willing to admit, she said. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she said. He reached over and turned off the kitchen light because the harsh overhead was wrong for the moment, and the light from the living room was enough, and sometimes the simplest adjustments were the right ones. They stood in the gentler dark for a moment. Whatever you decide to do in that room, he said, I want you to do it because you're ready, not because he pushed you there, on your timeline, with your preparation. And if his timeline comes first, she said, then we deal with it, he said, together, which is a word I don't use carelessly. She looked at him in the low light, and for a moment her expression lost all of its management, every layer of control and strategy, and the competent contained surface she showed the world. And what was underneath it was just a person, tired and angry and afraid, and also, somehow, in the way that people are when they're finally somewhere real, more present than she'd been in a very long time. I know you don't, she said. The city was doing its night work outside, the ordinary sounds of a place that doesn't stop for private crises, traffic, wind, the distant register of someone's music through a wall. And inside his kitchen, Logan Hayes and Vanessa Sterling stood in the half-dark with a problem neither of them had fully solved, and the specific quality of closeness that comes not from everything being all right, but from deciding, together and without ceremony, that whatever wasn't all right yet was going to be faced. He didn't know then what it was going to require. He only knew that whatever it required, he was going to be there for it. And she, for the first time in 4 years, believed him. The 3 weeks between that night in his kitchen and the board meeting were the most methodical 3 weeks of Vanessa Sterling's professional life. And she had run 3 companies from the ground up, so that was saying something. She didn't announce what she was doing. She didn't tell her PR team, didn't loop in her lawyers beyond the specific and limited consultation she needed for the evidentiary questions. Didn't say anything to her board members beyond the routine pre-meeting communications her assistant handled as a matter of course. The only people who knew what was coming were Logan, her assistant Petra, who had worked for her for 6 years and knew more about the Damien situation than anyone, and had once, on a Friday afternoon, asked Vanessa quietly if she wanted her to look into legal options, and received a not yet in response, and had been waiting since, and in the final week, her father. She'd called him on a Thursday, their regular call, the one ostensibly about quarterly reports, which had been gradually becoming something else over the months since his cardiac event. And she'd told him what she was planning. She'd done it calmly and thoroughly, and she'd given him the full picture, which she'd been protecting him from in pieces for years. And when she finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that she'd said, "Dad?" And her father, who was 71 and stubborn and recovering slowly and had built his first company in a city that didn't particularly want him to succeed, had said, "I should have known sooner. That's on me." "It's not on you," she said. "I'm your father," he said, as if that settled the logic. "What do you need?" "Nothing. I have what I need. I just wanted you to know." Another pause. "This man, Logan." She'd been careful about how much she'd told her father about Logan, not from secrecy, but from the particular caution of someone who'd learned that her father's enthusiasm, once engaged, was difficult to moderate. "Yes?" "Claudia Hayes is his sister," her father said. "You know Claudia?" "I met her at the Whitmore Literacy Gala 8 months ago," he said. "Sharp woman, very direct. She told me she had a brother who was single. Vanessa went very still. She told you that? She mentioned it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I mentioned it to your assistant because she seemed like a sensible person, and I thought, well... A pause that had the specific quality of a man trying to appear less strategically involved than he was. It seems things worked out. You and Claudia Hayes, Vanessa said. You two separately had the same idea. Great minds, her father said, without any apparent remorse. She'd sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at nothing, and then she'd laughed, genuinely laughed, in the particular way of someone discovering that the people who love them have been quietly conspiring on their behalf and finding it impossible to be irritated about it. You could have told me, she said. You would have said no, he said. You would have managed it to death before it had a chance to be anything. She didn't argue because he wasn't wrong. He sounds like a man with his head on straight, her father said. That's rarer than it should be. It is, she said. Good. A pause. Go to that meeting, Vanessa. Do what you should have done 2 years ago. I'll be here. That was the Thursday call. The preparation itself was Petra's masterwork. 6 years of working for Vanessa had made Petra exceptionally good at the particular kind of organizational precision that looked like calm from the outside and was actually controlled urgency on the inside. She'd compiled everything. The message logs, the metadata on the phone numbers that had contacted Logan, the attendance record showing Damien's pattern of appearing at Vanessa's public events across 41 months, the timeline of his positioning on the Aldridge Trust Board relative to the announcement of the Sterling Foundation's community project, the equity stake documentation from the original bridge loan, and its full repayment record. She'd organized it into a presentation that was factual and linear and entirely without editorializing, because editorializing would have given someone the option to argue about tone rather than substance. Logan had sat with Vanessa on the Sunday before the meeting, at his kitchen table. It was always the kitchen table, he'd noticed, and he'd stopped wondering why and just accepted it as the geography of this particular thing, while she walked him through it. He'd listened without interrupting until she finished. The messages he sent to my phone, he said. I have the metadata traced to a number registered to a Shell LLC, Petra said. She was on speaker, having been woven into the Sunday conversation at Logan's suggestion, because he'd wanted to understand the full picture, and Vanessa had long since stopped treating him as someone who needed to be protected from the operational reality of her life. The LLC has one registered agent who has a documented business relationship with Damien Cross going back 9 years. That's not direct, Logan said. No, Petra said, but in the context of everything else, it's strong circumstantial evidence of pattern behavior. What's the board composition? Logan asked. Aldridge Trust side. Vanessa pulled up a document on her laptop. 7 members. Of those 7, 2 have had professional friction with Damien in the past that's a matter of record. One resigned from a previous board position he also held, which was reported at the time as a philosophical difference about governance. I've since spoken informally with that person, and he was receptive is the word I'd use. He didn't commit to anything, but he listened. How many do you need? I don't need a vote, she said. I need the room to understand what's been happening clearly enough that his continued position becomes untenable. If enough of the right people see the documentation and the pattern, the institutional self-interest of the trust does the rest. Organizations like the Aldridge Trust live and die on their reputational relationships. If keeping Damien costs them more than removing him, they'll remove him. And if they don't, she looked at him directly, then I have a harder decision to make about the co-funding relationship. But I've modeled that scenario and the project survives it. Slower, but it survives. He nodded. You've prepared for losing. I've been preparing for losing since I launched my first company, she said. It's the only way to be genuinely ready to win. He looked at her across the table. The organized documents, the careful preparation, the particular stillness of someone who'd been afraid of a room for 4 years and had decided that the fear was not going to be the final word on the subject. You're ready, he said. I think so, she said. I'm also not sleeping well. That's different from not being ready, he said. I know, she said, but it's still unpleasant. What would help? She considered this with the seriousness she brought to practical questions. Honestly, Maisie's Insect City has been occupying a corner of my mind for 3 days. There's a structural problem with the river district I can't stop thinking about. He stared at her. The bridge is too narrow, she said, without apology. The throughput would be inadequate for the projected population. I'll tell her you said that, he said. She'll be insufferable about it. She's 7, Vanessa said. She's supposed to be insufferable. It's load-bearing at that age. He'd laughed, and she'd almost laughed. And the almost was enough because it broke the tension the preparation had been building all afternoon. And they'd spent the rest of the evening doing nothing in particular. Him reading, her working through documents at the other end of the couch. Maisie asleep in her room, the apartment quiet and inhabited and ordinary in the way that Logan had spent years learning to appreciate rather than mourn. The meeting was on a Wednesday. Downtown, in the conference facility attached to the Aldridge Trust's administrative offices, neutral ground that was, in practice, slightly Damien's ground, since he knew the space and its personnel and had attended meetings there for 4 years. Vanessa had been in the room before. She knew its dimensions and the sight lines and where the light came in at 2 in the afternoon. She'd chosen a seat at the midpoint of the table, not the head, which was deliberate. She wasn't positioning this as her room, she was positioning it as a shared room in which something true was going to be said. Logan drove her. She hadn't asked him to. She'd told him the meeting was Wednesday, and he'd said, "I'll drive you," with the same tone he used when something was settled in his mind and further discussion was organizational rather than substantive. And she'd understood that arguing would have been beside the point. He parked 2 blocks from the building, and she got out, and she stood on the sidewalk in the November cold with her bag over her shoulder, and the presentation on her tablet, and the 4 years of a situation she'd been managing finally reaching its full weight in her chest. All of it. The original gratitude and the slow recognition and the grinding, low-heat exhaustion of living adjacent to someone who'd decided he had claim. And she stood with all of it for a moment, just stood with it, not managing it, and then she took a breath, and it was a normal breath, not a dramatic one, just air. "Hey," Logan said. She looked at him over the roof of the car. "You're not asking for permission," he said. "You're not making an accusation. You're presenting facts to people who are going to have to decide what to do with them. That's all." "That's not all," she said. "No," he said, "but it's enough to start with." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned and walked toward the building. He didn't follow her. That had been understood. This was her room. The meeting began at 2 o'clock with the routine items: project updates, budget review, the standard administrative structure of an organization that ran on order. There were 14 people in the room, 6 from the Sterling Foundation side, 6 from the Aldridge Trust, and 2 independent advisors who served in a governance function. Damien was present as a trust representative, seated 3 positions to her left, which she noted without reacting to. He looked at her when she walked in. She knew that particular look, the one that was calibrated to appear warm and collegial for the room while communicating something else entirely to her specifically. She'd been receiving versions of it for 4 years. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away, not with the hurried quality of avoidance, but with the deliberate quality of someone who had already decided this look no longer had the power it used to have. She waited. She sat through the budget review. She contributed to the project timeline discussion with the focus and precision her foundation people expected of her because the work was real and deserved her full presence even here. She drank bad conference room coffee without complaining. She watched Damien perform his version of engaged and competent, the performance he'd been giving in rooms like this for years, and she recognized every beat of it now with the cold clarity of someone who'd had 4 years and 3 lawyers and 1 Sunday afternoon of preparation to understand it completely. When they reached the governance item on the agenda, the review of the co-funding structure, she said, "Before we go into the prepared materials on this, I'd like to raise something that I think needs to be in the room. It's directly relevant to the governance of this collaboration." The chair of the Aldridge Trust, a woman named Margaret Osai, who had run the organization for 11 years and had a reputation for being fair and not especially patient with anything that wasted her time, looked at her. "Go ahead, Vanessa." Vanessa opened her tablet. I'm going to share documentation, she said, that describes a pattern of conduct over the past 4 years that I believe constitutes a serious breach of professional ethics and has created a coercive dynamic that undermines the integrity of this collaboration. I want to be clear up front. Everything I'm about to present is documented. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. The room had gone the specific quiet of people recalibrating. She started with the timeline. She didn't start with the messages, didn't start with the photograph outside Logan's building, didn't start with the private communications Damien had threatened to weaponize. She started with facts and chronology, the way a person builds a case, not for emotional effect, but because the foundation had to be solid before the weight could be applied. She walked through the bridge loan and its repayment. She walked through the 14 months. She walked through the pattern of appearances at her events with dates and documentation, 41 instances across 4 years. She walked through the messages, the carefully deniable ones, the technically innocent ones, the ones designed to communicate presence and surveillance without providing legal traction. And she displayed them on the screen without commentary, letting the volume and pattern speak before she added a word. She was not performing distress. She'd decided this deliberately. Distress could be argued with, could be framed as sensitivity or misinterpretation. Facts were harder. Damien, to his credit, did not interrupt. She had enough peripheral awareness of him to know that he had gone very still in his chair, which was its own kind of information. Not panic, but the controlled stillness of someone running calculations and finding the numbers worse than expected. She walked through his positioning on the Aldridge Trust Board. She displayed the timeline of that positioning against the announcement of the community project, and she let the room do the math on the coincidence without specifying it as coincidence. Then she said, 2 weeks ago, I received documentation suggesting that he intends to use private personal correspondence from a period when we were in a relationship as leverage in connection with this project. I'm raising this here, in this room, rather than in a private conversation or a legal proceeding, because I believe the people in this room have a right to understand the nature of what has been operating in the background of this collaboration. And because the families who are going to be served by this project deserve a working relationship that isn't contaminated by this. The room was completely silent. Margaret Osei was looking at the documentation on the shared screen. Her expression was unreadable, but her stillness had a quality to it, the specific quality of someone making a decision. One of the independent advisors, a man named Theo Brennan, who'd been taking notes throughout, put down his pen. Damien spoke. I think, he said, and his voice was measured and careful and had the particular quality of someone performing reasonableness for an audience, that what Vanessa is describing reflects a significant mischaracterization of a professional relationship that's had some complexity. I'd want the opportunity to. Damien, Margaret said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the screen. Then she looked back at him. Do you have any factual dispute with the timeline of events as presented? She said. A beat. Some of the framing, he started. The dates, she said. The documented messages, the attendance record. Do you dispute any of those as factual matters? A longer beat. No, he said. The word landed in the room and did its work. Margaret looked at Vanessa. Thank you for bringing this forward. She looked at Theo Brennan. I think we need a brief recess to allow the Trust's Governance Committee to confer. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Vanessa sat in an anteroom with her foundation's legal advisor and did not look at her phone and did not eat the sandwich someone brought her and answered 2 questions her legal advisor asked her with the focused efficiency of someone who was conserving everything for what came next. Damien was not in the anteroom. She didn't know where he was. When the room reconvened, Margaret Osei sat down, arranged her papers, and said, The Aldridge Trust has decided to place Mr. Cross on administrative leave from his representation of the Trust, pending an internal governance review. He will not be participating in the remainder of today's meeting or any further proceedings connected to this collaboration until that review is concluded. Vanessa looked at the table in front of her. She did not allow herself the release of the thing building in her chest. Not yet. Not in the room. Damien stood up. For a moment he stood there, and she could feel him looking at her, and she kept her eyes on the table, but not from weakness, not from the old habitual avoidance, but because she had nothing left to say to him in this room, and she was not going to perform a confrontation for an audience. She'd said what needed to be said. The room had heard it. That was enough. He left. The door closed. Margaret said, "I want to be direct about something. What was presented today should have been raised with this body considerably earlier. I understand there were reasons it wasn't. But I want the Foundation to know that this organization takes the integrity of its partnership seriously, and that what was presented today, if confirmed by the internal review, which I expect it will be, represents a significant breach of conduct that we take seriously." "Thank you," Vanessa said. "The co-funding commitment to the community project is not in question," Margaret said. "The project proceeds on the agreed timeline." Vanessa breathed. It was an ordinary breath, the same kind she'd taken on the sidewalk 2 hours ago, and it contained everything. The meeting wrapped in 40 minutes. The routine business that had been deferred by the recess was handled efficiently, and then people gathered their things and the room emptied with the purposeful normalcy of people who had work to return to. Theo Brennan paused beside her as he was leaving. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I've been in rooms with Damien Cross for 3 years and there was always something I couldn't name. Now I can." He didn't wait for a response, just nodded and walked out. She stood in the conference room after it was empty. Her foundation's legal advisor was packing up documents, and Petra was on the phone in the hallway, and Vanessa stood at the window and looked at the street below. The ordinary afternoon street, the November light flat and gray and real, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of 4 years lifting. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something more structural than that. It was the feeling of a load-bearing element that had been incorrectly placed finally being removed and finding that the building held. She texted Logan, "It's done." He replied in 40 seconds, "I'm outside, same spot." She gathered her things. She thanked her legal advisor. She walked through the lobby of the building and out through the glass doors into the November air, and he was there leaning against the car with his hands in his jacket pockets. And he looked at her face when she came out, and she watched him read it. "Okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "He's out. Administrative leave pending review. Margaret Osei she was fair and clear." He nodded. "The project's safe," she said. "Timeline intact." He nodded again. "I'm not going to cry in the street," she said, which was a warning, or a note to herself, or both. "Nobody asked you to," he said. She stood in front of him, and the November wind did something with her hair, and she didn't fix it, and she looked at him. This man with the 6-year-old Civic and the scratched kitchen table and the daughter who worried about spider relocation. And she felt the things she'd been not feeling in the conference room. "Thank you," she said. "For driving?" he said. "For not driving me," she said. "For knowing the difference." He looked at her for a moment. "Come on," he said. "Maisie gets out of school in an hour. She wants to show you what she did with the River District." "She fixed the bridge?" Vanessa said. "She demolished it entirely," he said, "and built a tunnel system. I've been told it's more efficient." "She's not wrong," Vanessa said. He opened the car door and she got in, and he walked around to the driver's side and they drove through the November city, the flat light and the ordinary streets, and the world that had continued doing its indifferent work, while something significant had happened in a conference room on the 14th floor. And she sat in the passenger seat of his 6-year-old Civic and looked out the window and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like the space around her was her own. It wasn't over exactly. The governance review would take time. There would be conversations and logistics and probably a period of managing the aftermath in ways she couldn't yet fully anticipate. Damien wasn't destroyed. He still had resources and connections and the particular resilience of someone who'd been constructing their position for years. But the architecture had shifted. The leverage he'd been holding had been brought into a room and examined in daylight, and daylight was the one thing that kind of leverage genuinely couldn't survive. Logan drove. Neither of them talked. The radio was on low, something unhurried, and the city moved past the windows, and Vanessa Sterling sat with the quiet of someone who had done a hard and necessary thing and was still in the first hour of understanding what it meant. She looked at his hands on the wheel. She looked at the car seat in the back, Maisie's jacket folded on it, one small sneaker somehow abandoned on the seat beside it. She looked at the scuff on his shoe that she'd noticed the first night and that he'd apparently never gotten around to fixing. She thought about her father upstate, who would call her on Thursday and pretend the call was about quarterly reports. She thought about Claudia Hayes, who had walked up to a 71-year-old man at a gala and apparently talked to him about his daughter's loneliness with the specific directness of someone who had decided something needed to happen and was going to facilitate it, whether the relevant parties had gotten there themselves or not. She thought about a taco truck and string lights and plastic chairs and a night 6 weeks ago when she'd taken off her shoes on a sidewalk and chosen honesty over appearance and found, on the other side of it, something she hadn't expected to find. "Hey," she said. He glanced at her. "I'm glad Claudia talked to my father," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Me too." "And I'm glad you didn't get rid of that scuff," she said. He looked at her sideways. "What?" "First night. Ardent. You had a scuff on your left shoe and you noticed it in the lobby and you didn't fix it or make a thing of it. You just walked in anyway." She looked forward. "I decided something about you in that moment." "What did you decide?" "That you weren't there to perform," she said. "That you were just there." He drove for a moment. "My shoe polishing kit is in a box somewhere," he said. "I moved 11 months ago." "I know," she said. "Don't find it." He laughed and she laughed, and the November city went about its business around them. And 2 blocks ahead a crossing light turned green as they approached, which was not symbolic, just timing, but felt like something anyway. The governance review took 6 weeks. Vanessa had expected it to take longer, which said something about how carefully the Aldridge Trust had looked at what she'd presented. Damien's administrative leave became a permanent separation from the trust board by the 2nd week of December, announced in language that was institutional and bloodless and said nothing specific about the reasons, which was how these things worked, which she'd accepted. The co-funding commitment was formalized in writing the same week, with a clean transfer of oversight to a trust representative who had no prior relationship with either of them, and the community project's timeline was confirmed without modification. Damien did not fight it publicly. She'd expected that too, in the way you expect things you've spent years understanding. Not with certainty, but with the particular knowledge of someone who has studied a person long enough to know how they'll move when the position they've built becomes indefensible. He was intelligent. He'd always been intelligent. He understood the difference between a battle worth fighting and one that would cost him more than the concession, and this was the second kind, and he retreated with the careful quiet of someone salvaging what he could. The private messages, the correspondence he'd held for years as a potential weapon, were never used. She didn't know whether that was a decision or a calculation, or whether someone had advised him that deploying them would have made his situation considerably worse. She didn't spend much time on the question. The silence was enough. What she spent more time on was something harder to categorize. The particular adjustment of living in the aftermath of a thing you've been managing for 4 years when the management is suddenly no longer required. She'd expected relief, and there was relief, but there was also a kind of disorientation. The feeling of a muscle that had been clenched so long it didn't know immediately how to release. She caught herself, in the first weeks, checking her phone for the specific quality of message she was no longer receiving. She caught herself planning exits from events based on a threat that was no longer present. Old reflexes from old architecture. She mentioned this to Logan one evening, without drama, as an observation, and he'd listened and said, "That makes sense. You built the reflexes for a reason. They don't disappear just because the reason does." "It's disorienting," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That's what recovering from something feels like. People expect it to feel like relief, and then they're confused when it's also just strange." She looked at him. "You sound like you know that from personal experience." "When Maisie's mother left," he said, "I'd been in a state of low-level anticipatory anxiety for the last 4 months of the relationship because I could feel something coming and couldn't name it. And when it finally happened, when she actually said it, the first thing I felt wasn't grief. It was this strange, off-balance clarity, like, oh, so this was the thing I was waiting for." He paused. "It took a while to figure out what to do in a life that didn't have the waiting in it anymore." "What did you do?" Made pasta, he said. Rearranged my kitchen. Signed up for a design certification I'd been putting off. The usual low-drama responses to significant life events. She almost smiled. You're very pragmatic about your own emotional experiences. I grew up with very little margin for the alternative, he said, without self-pity, in the tone of a man stating a simple fact about his formation. My mother worked doubles, and my father's back was bad, and there was always something practical that needed doing. You processed on the move or you didn't process, and not processing turned out to have consequences. So you learned to do it while your hands were occupied. This was the thing about him, she'd realized over the months. The way his emotional intelligence wasn't performed or decorated, but was just embedded in how he moved through the world, as practical and unflashy as everything else about him. He didn't describe his feelings like a person in a self-help book. He described them like a contractor assessing a structure. Here's what's load-bearing, here's what isn't, here's what needs attention before the next phase of work. She'd been learning from it without meaning to, the way you learn things from proximity to someone whose approach to living is genuinely different from your own. December moved into January. The community project, the Family Resource Center in the south side of the city, entered its final phase of pre-construction planning with the funding fully secured and the timeline intact. Vanessa had been overseeing it for 18 months, and there was something specific about walking through the site in January, the cleared lot with the architectural markers in the frozen ground, that felt different now than it had in November. The project had existed under the shadow of Damien's presence for so long that she'd partially stopped being able to see it on its own terms. Now she could. She walked the site on a Tuesday morning with the project architect and the foundation's construction liaison and a city planning representative, and she stood in what would eventually be the main entrance and looked at where the after-school program space would be, the large open room with north-facing windows, designed to have good light in the afternoon when kids would be doing homework. And she thought about her father, who had grown up in a neighborhood not entirely unlike this one, and about what it would have meant to him at 8 or 9 to have a place like this to go to after school. She thought about Maisie, who had never had to wonder whether there was a safe place to be. She thought about the kind of luck that shapes a life before you have any say in the terms. Logan came to the site on a Saturday, when the preliminary framing had gone up, and you could begin to see the building's shape in 3 dimensions for the first time. Maisie came too. She'd been told there was a construction site involved and had arrived in her most important-looking jacket with a notebook she'd decided was a site log, and she'd taken her documentation responsibilities seriously, recording the dimensions of things she'd been told, and some she appeared to have estimated independently. The window is wrong, she told the project architect, pointing at the framing for one of the ground floor windows. The architect, who was 43 and had 2 decades of professional experience, looked at where she was pointing. What's wrong with it? It's too high, Maisie said. The kids in the after-school room won't be able to see out. They'll just see sky. The architect looked at the framing. He looked at Maisie. He pulled out his own tablet and checked the drawings. She's right, he said, to nobody in particular. Logan looked at Vanessa. Don't, Vanessa said. I didn't say anything, he said. You were going to say something about her instincts. I was going to say something about her instincts, he agreed. The window was adjusted in the revised drawings the following week. Maisie added this to her site log under a heading she'd titled Corrections, which she kept separate from her observations section with a dividing line drawn in red marker, and which she showed to Vanessa with the professional satisfaction of someone whose findings had been acted upon. This is excellent documentation, Vanessa told her. I know, Maisie said. Dad says I should have been an engineer, but I think I want to be a city planner so I get to decide where things go instead of just building what someone else decided. Vanessa looked at the notebook. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said. Maisie considered this. Like how Dad designs kitchens but also tells people when their idea is bad? Exactly like that, Vanessa said. Okay, Maisie said, and wrote something in the observations section that Vanessa was fairly certain read. City planner and engineer both. The relationship between Maisie and Vanessa had developed the way honest things develop. Not smoothly, not without friction, but with a kind of genuine texture that made it real. Maisie was not a simple child. She was observant in the way of a person who'd learned early to read the emotional temperature of rooms, which Logan had told Vanessa was something that had developed after her mother left, and which he kept a quiet eye on. Not anxiously, but carefully, the way you keep an eye on something that has healed well, but whose scar you respect. She had asked Vanessa in January, with the direct bluntness of her nature, "Are you going to stay?" They'd been in the kitchen, Logan's kitchen, the scratch table, the repositioned sink, and Logan had been 2 rooms away, and Maisie had asked it while drawing in her notebook without looking up, which Vanessa had understood was deliberate, the same way adults sometimes look away when they ask the question they most need answered. Vanessa had not given her the easy answer. The easy answer would have been some warm and reassuring variation of course. And Maisie was 7 years old and had her mother's Vancouver address on a birthday card in her room, and would have recognized an easy answer for exactly what it was. "I want to," Vanessa said, "and I'm not going anywhere right now. But I think the honest answer is that staying isn't something one person decides. It's something people build together, you and me and your dad." She paused. "Does that make sense?" Maisie was quiet for a moment, still drawing. "It's like construction," she said. "You can't just decide the building is finished. You have to actually build it." "Yes," Vanessa said. "That's exactly what it's like." Maisie looked up. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone who had received sufficient information to proceed. "Dad makes good pasta. Do you cook anything?" "I make excellent scrambled eggs," Vanessa said. "Nothing else to speak of." "That's fine," Maisie said, with the benevolent pragmatism of someone recalibrating a plan. "Dad does the cooking, and you do the building things." "That's a reasonable division of labor," Vanessa said. "I know," said Maisie, and went back to drawing. Vanessa's father came to the city in February. He was well enough to travel. The cardiologist had cleared him for limited activity in December, and he'd been testing the limits of limited ever since, which was fully expected and not entirely unwelcome because a completely sedentary version of her father was a version of her father that worried her more than an active one. He came down on a Thursday, and she picked him up herself, which he commented on because she usually sent a car. "I wanted to drive," she said. "You wanted to see my face when I got off the train," he said. "Both things are true," she said. He looked older than he had before the cardiac event, which she'd been preparing herself for and still found, in practice, harder than the preparation had accounted for. The weight had come back, but not all the way. There was a carefulness to how he moved that was new, a small hesitation before steps he'd previously taken without thought, and she watched it without letting herself watch it, which was a skill she'd developed and which required constant maintenance. They had dinner at her apartment, just the 2 of them, and she cooked. She'd been learning, quietly, a limited repertoire of things that were manageable for someone whose cooking skills had never progressed beyond the functional necessities of someone who lived alone and ordered in half the week. She'd learned the pasta. She wasn't going to tell Logan she'd learned the pasta. Her father ate it and said, "This is good," in a tone of mild surprise that she found, against her will, funny. "I've been practicing," she said. "For whom?" he said, with the specific innocence of a man who already knew the answer. She looked at him. "He's coming Saturday," she said. "Him and Maisie. I thought you should meet them." Her father put down his fork and looked at her in the way he had. Not the boardroom look, not the strategic one, but the other one. The one she'd seen intermittently throughout her life that she associated with specific moments when he'd looked at her and seen something that made him want to say something he didn't have the words for, so he said nothing, just looked, and the look contained everything. "Good," he said finally. "Don't be overwhelming," she said. "I'm never overwhelming," he said. "You are consistently overwhelming," she said. "You come in with a position on everything within 3 minutes, and you ask questions that are actually arguments, and you intimidate people who are perfectly comfortable people in their normal lives." "I'm interested in people," he said. "You're interested in whether people are good enough," she said. "Which is not the same thing, and Maisie is 7, and I need her to not be interviewed." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Is she?" he said. "Good. I mean." Vanessa thought about the sight log, the River District Bridge, the window that was too high. "She's formidable," she said. Her father smiled. It was the smile that had, her whole life, communicated more than most people's full sentences. And him? Consistent, she said. He's the most consistent person I've ever met. He's the same in every room, in every conversation, whether there's something to gain or not. I didn't know how rare that was until I found it. Her father nodded slowly. Your mother was like that, he said. Vanessa looked at the table. Her mother had died when she was 16, and in the years since, her father had spoken of her in the specific, careful way of someone who loved a memory enough to treat it gently. He didn't invoke her often. When he did, it meant something. I know, Vanessa said. Saturday was not an interview. Her father was not on his best behavior, because best behavior implied suppression, and her father didn't suppress. But he was his actual self, rather than his professional self, which was a distinction Vanessa had come to understand only in the last few years. His actual self was warm and curious, and told stories that went longer than necessary, and had a quality that made you feel, despite yourself, like you were sitting in the most interesting room you'd ever been in. Maisie sat next to him at lunch, Vanessa's dining table, extended fully for the first time in longer than she could remember, and informed him within 15 minutes that she was going to be a city planner and possibly also an engineer, and that she had documentation of a window correction at a construction site in the South Side if he wanted to review her methodology. Vanessa's father looked at Maisie with an expression Vanessa recognized from across the table. I would very much like to review your methodology, he said. Maisie produced the site log. Logan, beside Vanessa, said very quietly, She brought the site log to lunch. Of course she did, Vanessa said, equally quietly. She doesn't go anywhere without it now. Your daughter is operating at a level of professional preparation that puts most of my board members to shame, Vanessa said. I know, Logan said. It's deeply humbling. They watched Maisie walk Vanessa's father through the corrections section with the focused gravity of a contractor presenting findings, and Vanessa's father listened with the genuine attention of a man who had spent 50 years in business and knew the difference between a person performing seriousness and a person who actually possessed it. She's going to change things, her father said when the methodology review concluded. I know, Maisie said without apparent surprise. Logan covered his face with his hand. Vanessa laughed. Her father laughed. Maisie looked around at the adults with the mild confusion of someone who had said a true thing and couldn't understand why it was also funny. The afternoon was long and unhurried and real, and Vanessa sat in the middle of it and let herself have it fully. Let herself be present in the way that 4 years of managed living under Damien's shadow had made difficult. The constant low-level hypervigilance that required part of your attention at all times, that never fully allowed you to be simply where you were. She had been returning to the present, slowly, in the months since the board meeting, the way a person returns to a room they've been away from and remembers, with some surprise, that the room was always this good. After lunch, her father took his coffee to the window and stood looking out at the February city, and Logan came and stood near him, and Vanessa, from the kitchen where she was doing the irrational thing of cleaning up rather than letting her assistant handle it, could see them through the doorway, talking. She couldn't hear what they said. She didn't try to. She watched them for a moment. The 71-year-old man who had built things from nothing, and the 32-year-old man who designed spaces for other people's lives, standing at her window looking at the city they both belonged to, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have an exact word for, but that she recognized, distantly, as a version of peace. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was. Her father's health was a real thing, a continuing thing, not resolved by one good day or one good month. The governance fallout from the Aldridge situation required ongoing management. There were professional relationships she was rebuilding, others she'd decided not to rebuild, adjustments to the foundation's operational structure that were still in process. Logan had a difficult client that winter who'd complained about his work to a contractor association in a way that had required several weeks of professional navigation. Maisie had gone through a period in February of waking up at night from bad dreams, whose content she wouldn't describe, which Logan handled with the particular competence of a parent who'd been doing this alone for years, and which still cost him something, visible only in how tired he looked some mornings. Life was not, it turned out, the version that resolved cleanly once the central obstacle was removed. It was the same ongoing accumulation of things that needed attention, and things that went sideways, and things that were good, but not uncomplicated. And the obstacles removal just meant you were doing that work in a space that was finally, genuinely your own. This was, Vanessa had come to understand, the actual nature of the thing she'd been missing. Not happiness in the magazine cover sense, not the life that photographed well, but the ordinary, difficult, ongoing reality of a life that was being built honestly, with real materials, by people who had decided to tell the truth to each other, even when easier options were available. The one-year mark arrived in early October. She remembered it before he mentioned it. She'd been aware of the date approaching for weeks, not with any particular plan attached, just with the quality of awareness that certain dates acquire when they've become anchored to something significant. October. Ardent. M. Carroll. A scuffed shoe. Shoes taken off on a sidewalk. He brought it up on a Thursday. They were at his kitchen table, so still the scratched one. He had not bought a new table, which she'd accepted as a permanent condition of the space she loved. And Maisie was at her grandmother's for the night, and he said, "The reservation at Ardent was this week last year." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to do with that?" She considered. "Not eat at Ardent," she said. "Obviously," he said. "Same taco truck?" she said. "Same taco truck," he said. "But I want to go back to Ardent first." She looked at him. "Not to eat," he said. "Just to walk past it. Just to remember the version of us that was in that lobby for about 40 seconds before we decided to leave." She thought about that version. The man with the scuffed shoe who'd said, "I'm not sure about here specifically," and the woman who'd arrived under a borrowed name and had been fully prepared to write the evening off as another well-intentioned catastrophe. Two people who had both been carrying things they'd stopped expecting anyone else to help hold, meeting in a room designed for performance and deciding almost immediately that performance wasn't what they were there for. "Okay," she said. "We walked past. Then we walked 6 blocks. Then tacos," he said. "Then tacos," she said. He had, it turned out, made a reservation, not at Ardent, but at the park beside it, which was the kind of reservation that required knowing someone in the city's parks department, which Logan did, through a client whose renovation had included a consultation with the department about outdoor space integration, and which had resulted in a small picnic permit for a specific bench near the path that ran along the building's south side. He'd told her none of this in advance. She found out only when they arrived and he produced a bag that contained, among other things, 2 orders of al pastor and 2 of carnitas in takeout containers from Jorge's truck, acquired an hour earlier while she was finishing a call with her foundation's director. "You planned this," she said, looking at the bag. "I had a general sense of a direction," he said. "You called someone in the parks department." "Coincidentally, yes." She looked at him. "I wanted the bench," he said. "The specific bench. It faces toward the street and you can see the Ardent sign from it, but you're not in front of it. You're adjacent to it. I thought that was the right geography for a 1-year anniversary." She sat down on the bench. He sat beside her. He opened the bag and handed her the carnitas, and she took it, and they sat in the October evening. Cooler this year, or maybe the same and she'd forgotten, the specific October quality of light that arrived in the late afternoon like something reluctant to leave. And they ate. The Ardent sign was visible from where they sat, like he'd said. She could see the entrance, the polished doors, the small line of people waiting for tables. She could see the kind of evening in there, the amber light, the white tablecloths, the couples who looked like they were performing themselves for each other. She'd been one of them, once, many times, in many cities, in many versions of the curated life she'd been building to fill a space whose actual shape she hadn't been willing to examine. "What were you thinking," she said, "when you walked in that night?" He was eating. He thought about it, which meant he didn't answer immediately, which was his way. "I was thinking about turning around," he said. "Twice, actually. On the drive over and again in the parking garage." "What stopped you?" "Claudia would have been insufferable about it for approximately 5 years," he said. She laughed. "And something else," he said. "I don't know exactly what. Some version of... I'd been saying no to things for 1.5 years, and there's a point where saying no becomes its own kind of cowardice, and I was starting to feel that." She looked at the street. I was going to be Carol the whole night and never see you again. I know, he said. You told me. And then you said you weren't sure about the restaurant, she said. And I thought, oh, this one's different. Because I said I wasn't sure about the restaurant. Because you said it like it was just true, she said. Like the truth was available and you were just going to use it without deciding first whether it was safe. She was quiet for a moment. I'd forgotten that people did that. I'd been in rooms for so long where nobody just said the true thing without calculating the cost first. He said nothing, eating, letting it be. You know what I think about now, she said, when I think about that night? What? The walk, she said. 6 blocks. You didn't suggest calling a car and I didn't want one, and I just took off my shoes and we walked. And I kept thinking, who is this person who doesn't make arrangements, who just walks, who assumes the sidewalk is fine? She looked at him. Nobody in my life just walks. Everyone in my life is in a car, or in a meeting, or in a building, and the city is something that happens outside the window. But you put your hands in your pockets and you walked like the city was yours. It is mine, he said simply. I grew up here. I know where everything is. I grew up here too, she said, and I didn't know where the taco truck was. Different part of it, he said. That's the thing about cities. They're not one place. They're 50 places in the same geography, and most people only ever know their own version. She thought about that, about the city her father had grown up in, the northeast corner, the one Logan had described as transitional for 20 years, and the city she'd grown up in, the private schools and the carefully arranged social geography, and about how those two cities shared the same streets and the same bridges and the same October light and almost never touched. The project, she said, the resource center, it opens in March. I know, he said. My father wants to come for the opening. Maisie already asked if she can give a speech, Logan said. Vanessa looked at him. She's 7. She's aware of that, he said. She considers it an asset, lower expectations. Vanessa looked at the street for a moment, and then she laughed, a real one, the same kind she'd laughed that first night, the unguarded version that came from somewhere she didn't manage. And Logan laughed, and the October city went on around them, unhurried and enormous, and full of its ordinary business. There was something she'd been thinking about for weeks and hadn't said, not because she was afraid of it, but because she was learning to be careful with the things that mattered, to hold them for the right moment rather than rushing them, which was newer behavior for her and didn't always come naturally. She set down the takeout container and looked at the Ardent sign and then at him. I want to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. When I was 23 and I was terrified and I was running out of money and nobody would say yes, she said, I made a decision that the most important thing was to survive, to keep the company alive. And I made that the center of everything, not just professionally, but personally, structurally, the whole way I lived. Everything was in service of the survival and then the success and then the next thing after that. She paused. And for a long time that worked, or it seemed to work. I built things I'm genuinely proud of. I made decisions I'd make again. But somewhere along the way, I confused the strategy for the life. I was so good at managing everything that I forgot there were things you weren't supposed to manage. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd had from the beginning, the kind that incorporated rather than reflected. And then my father was in a hospital bed, she said, and I was in a parking lot outside a gala at 1 a.m. wondering who was in the car with me because the car was empty, and I think I understood then, that the survival had worked and something else had gotten lost in it. She looked at him. And then my assistant called Claudia Hayes, and Claudia Hayes apparently had already talked to my father, and I walked into a restaurant under a borrowed name expecting nothing, and you said you weren't sure about the restaurant. He didn't say anything. I'm not saying you fixed something, she said. I want to be clear about that. I fixed it. I showed up in that room and I said what needed to be said, and I rebuilt the things that needed rebuilding. That was mine. A pause. But you made it possible to believe it was worth doing. That's different. That's not rescuing someone. That's just being the kind of person whose presence makes the case for the whole endeavor. The city hummed around them. The string lights on the fence across the park had come on while they were talking. The same orange-yellow she remembered from the taco truck, strung by someone who'd had an opinion about the value of that kind of light, in an October evening, and she thought the person had been right. Logan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Can I tell you something back?" "Yes," she said. "I've been raising Maisie alone for 6 years," he said, "and it's the best thing in my life, and it's a lot to carry without someone who actually sees it. Not someone who thinks it's impressive that I do it. Someone who just sees it for what it is, which is hard and ordinary and full of stuff that doesn't resolve, and also full of things I wouldn't trade for anything." He looked at the takeout container. "My ex-girlfriend was a good person who realized she didn't want to be a stepmother. The woman before that was too far into her own things to have room for ours. And I understood both of those. I didn't blame either of them, but I also made a decision, somewhere in there, that I wasn't going to let anyone close enough to leave again. I was going to be fine. We were going to be fine, and fine was going to be enough." "But," she said. "But fine is a lie you tell yourself," he said, "when you're afraid the real thing isn't available." He looked at her. "And then you walked out of Ardent in bare feet carrying your shoes, and you said the restaurant was airless, and I thought, oh, here's the real thing, right here." She looked at him. "There are moments that don't announce themselves as significant while they're happening, that reveal their weight only in retrospect. And there are moments that do both simultaneously, that you feel in the present tense as they're occurring. This was the second kind. She felt it clearly and didn't try to manage it, which was the newest thing about herself that she'd been learning, the thing she was still learning, the practice of letting the real thing be real without immediately cataloging it or containing it or protecting herself from its full dimensions. She reached over and took his hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just reached over on the park bench in the October evening with the taco truck containers between them and the Ardent sign visible across the street, and took his hand the way you take the hand of someone you've decided to stop being careful around. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while, not talking, which was its own kind of language, the language of two people who'd learned, separately and with difficulty, that the silence didn't need to be filled, that some of the realest things happened in it. The city moved around them. A couple walked past with a dog. A kid on a bicycle took the corner too fast and course-corrected with the unconcerned confidence of someone who'd done it before. Somewhere nearby, someone was cooking something that made the October air smell briefly like garlic and warmth. Vanessa thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, arriving under a borrowed name, fully prepared to have a transaction of an evening and write it off by midnight. She thought about the years before that, the managing, the containment, the 41 visits she'd documented without wanting to, the low-level exhaustion of a life that had been, in small ways, not fully hers. She thought about Maisie's sight log, her father at the window of her apartment, talking to Logan. The window that was too high and got corrected. The river district that needed a tunnel system rather than a bridge. She thought about the things that get built when you stop being afraid of the raw materials. "I want to stay," she said, "for what it's worth. To answer the question she asked me in January, I want to stay." "She asked you that?" he said. "In the kitchen," Vanessa said. "While you were in the other room, she didn't look up from her notebook." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that staying is something people build together," she said, "not something one person decides." He thought about that. "Okay," he said, "then let's build it." It was not a grand declaration. It didn't have music behind it or a dramatic quality. It was just two people on a bench in October making an honest statement about what they intended, which was the only kind of statement that had ever meant anything to either of them. "Okay," she said. He squeezed her hand once. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not performatively, just because it was there and the evening was cold and it was the right place to be. And they sat together in the city that belonged to both of them, the city they'd grown up in from different corners, the city where a taco truck parked outside a laundromat had better food than a $200 restaurant, and the light from a string of bulbs stapled to a fence was the best light either of them had ever eaten under. The thing that nobody tells you about the real story, the one that isn't the version designed to impress, is that it doesn't have a clean shape. It doesn't arc the way a performance does. It has rough edges and structural problems that need addressing, and windows that are too high and tunnels where you expected bridges. And some of the most important things happen not at climactic moments, but at kitchen tables and on park benches, and in the middle of conversations that began as something else. The thing nobody tells you is that the people who matter most are often the ones who arrive without fanfare, who don't fit the shape you'd been holding a space for, who say I'm not sure about the restaurant and mean it completely, who walk 6 blocks in October with their hands in their pockets like the city is theirs. Because it is. It always has been. They just never stop to perform that fact for anyone. The thing nobody tells you is that the greatest risk isn't loving someone. It's deciding, after everything, to tell the truth and mean it, and then staying in the room long enough to find out what the truth builds. They stayed on the bench until the light was fully gone and the city settled into its nighttime register, and then they walked back to the car, and the 6-year-old Civic started on the first try, which Logan took as a good sign in the way of a person who found good signs in functional machinery rather than more abstract places. And Vanessa thought that was one of the things she loved about him, that specific groundedness, that refusal to reach for the elevated version when the ordinary one was sitting right there and entirely sufficient. She thought the word loved without managing it or examining it, and then she thought it again, deliberately, and it held. The city opened ahead of them through the windshield, all lights and ordinary motion, doing the work it always did, indifferent and enormous, and full of things beginning. They drove through it together,